Hi guys, happy Monday. Let me make sure the volume is right. So today we're going to be discussing the first half roughly of The Sun Also Rises. Um, I'm interested in talking to you later to see what you thought about it. I know that before I read this book, I thought it would be so great because the time period always seemed really interesting to me, and I absolutely love Paris. Um, and yeah, it just seemed conceptually also interesting. A group of artists go abroad because they are not really satisfied with American life. But I was actually really disappointed when I read it for the first time. And I've come to find out just in doing research that I'm not the only one. So um, so we'll go over some sort of basic background information, and then go over or I'll discuss some different reviews, and then we will turn to the text. And I will also tell you what the discussion question will be. And as you know, you won't be posting your responses. We'll be meeting through Zoom. What time does our class start? 12:30. So we'll be meeting at 1:30 through Zoom, and everyone will weigh in on the discussion question. And we can also discuss the paper, which is not being assigned because, we'll talk about that later. But so The Sun Also Rises. Hemingway began writing this in 1925 in Madrid. And as he initially conceived it, it was supposed to be about the corruption of a young bullfighter. Now, we're not reading the whole book, but if you did like the first half and you are kind of a little bored at home and you read the second half, you would see that Brett, who is the female character, there are several female characters, but she's really the only one that has any, I guess, substance. The others are pretty interchangeable, and you can't really keep track of who they are. But in the second half, which we're not reading, Brett, who I believe is in her early 30s, gets involved with a young bullfighter. And he's considerably younger than her. I want to say he's 19, maybe he's in his early 20s at most. But and especially, times were different then. So even now, with a woman in her, let's say, 33, dating a 19-year-old would be frowned upon, I think. But going back into the 1920s, definitely. And Brett is American, and the bullfighter, his name is Pedro Romero, he's Spanish, and the bullfighters are viewed, they're looked at as being, I don't want to say special, but for lack of a better word, they are different than everyone else. They're kind of a breed apart. So not only is she with this young Spanish guy, and she's British, but so not only is she a foreign woman with this young Spanish guy, but he's also a bullfighter, and he's a very talented bullfighter. So that makes people feel even more, that bothers people even more. But then in the end, she lets him go because she recognizes it's the better thing to do. And why am I telling you that? Oh, because Hemingway's original idea was for this to be about the corruption of a young bullfighter. So I'm not sure if the corruption was supposed to be by Brett or by a woman. I don't know. But as the book evolved, it became more about the narrator, who you probably know by now is Jake Barnes. And he has a disability or an injury that he sustained in World War I. And what that means for him is that he can't have sexual relations with women. So this creates a problem for him and Brett, because you definitely get the sense that they are into each other, and that if it wasn't for this disability, well, I get that sense, that if it wasn't for this disability, they would be together. But there are scenes where they'll be talking about their feelings for one another, and it's usually Brett, but it's one of them who will say, "Oh, this can't work," or "Let's not do this again." So you wonder, well, why can't it work? And it's never really explicitly stated, but it's kind of it's implied, and just through reading between the lines, you can figure that that's the reason, because he has this disability or this injury. So anyway, as to the novel, when it first came out, I think this was, 1926, yeah. So when it first came out, a lot of people thought it was very bad. And when I say people, I mean not just reviewers, but even Hemingway's mother thought it was horrible. Why? Because if you've read it, you'll notice that not a lot happens. There's not a lot of plot. And most of the characters are not really very, I'm going to say admirable, but none of them really do much. They just kind of get up and go sit in cafes or bars, and they drink excessively, seems just about every night. And they all kind of, to me, there's this sense of, the word is malaise, like dis-ease, that permeates the novel. Even when you read it, I walk away from it with this sense of, not calm or peace, but this sense of dis-ease. And that's what the novel is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about this sense of malaise that was felt in the war, or in the world after World War One. Why? Well, because World War One was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It was supposed to be the war that would make the world safe for democracy. And the sentiment was that it didn't really do much except create a lot of casualties. And young people especially felt that, but there was a sense throughout the country, throughout America, and I'm sure through Europe, that the beliefs, and kind of like we talked about with modernism, the previously sustaining beliefs, traditions, and structures were no longer, there was a sense that you couldn't depend on them, that they were not reliable, that they weren't real. So, for example, the government or religion, that those were things that you could not count on anymore. So, one argument is, well, okay, the book is about people who are aimless and don't really do anything, because that was the feeling of the times as a result of the war. Nobody really, especially young people, knew what to do. So a lot of them went to Europe because of the favorable exchange rate, and tried to find a different way of life. And so that's why the novel, the conversation, and the activity is a bit vapid or empty, because it's supposed to be about this emptiness that was felt post World War One. But I don't know if that's a good enough reason for me. Let's see. So one thing that is, I guess, a positive and a universal, pretty much all of the critics, even those who considered the content as empty or just kind of, I don't know, the look of sort of tawdry, everyone really appreciated the writing and the style of the prose. So you probably noticed that Hemingway's writing, it's very sparse, it's sharp. There aren't any extraneous words. I would make the argument that every word that is there because it has to be there, and that if you cut any word from a sentence, it would alter the meaning of the sentence. I think that the language is every word that's there is there because it really has to be. And I often tell students in essays or when I'm commenting that, you don't want extraneous language. If a phrase or a word isn't doing something, if it doesn't need to be there, get it out of there. So Hemingway's writing was recognized by everyone as being very sharp, clear, precise, and just being very good writing. And he used something that was called the iceberg technique. And what this meant was that what lay beneath the surface, so what we could see as readers, was only 1/8 of what was actually there, and the other 7/8 lay beneath the surface. So, yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting analogy. 7/8. There's 1/8 that we see consciously, and then there's 7/8 more there that is beneath the surface that we can't really see. That works, I guess, on a symbolic or a metaphorical level. So let's see, just a little bit of background information, which I started to say a few minutes ago, but many Americans went to Europe in the 1920s. Along with the post-war angst, there was also prohibition, which many wanted to get away from. Of course, that was the ban on alcohol and what was seen as an overall trend towards Puritanism throughout the country. So especially young people, you could understand why wanted to get away from that to an atmosphere that seemed more conducive to, I guess, growth and exploration. The lifestyle in Europe was generally considered by most Americans to be a waste of time and to be un-American because most of the people who went there didn't work, or there were some who were artists and writers. There were some artists and writers, but there was also a joke or kind of a stereotype of the artist / writer who didn't really do anything except sit in cafes all day and drink. Hemingway actually wrote about artists like that in a piece that he wrote for the Toronto Star. I think I have the quote. I'll read it to you later. So, tons of young Americans went to Europe. None of them really worked. There were a few who made art and wrote and were successful, but by and large, they just went to Europe and kind of just wafted around. Let's see. So interestingly, Hemingway, as I just told you, he really didn't like the other Americans who were there. He considered them to be lazy and entitled. But an interesting fact is that he and his wife and their son lived off of her trust fund until his writing became successful. He did work for a newspaper and write little stories and little pieces here and there, but the truth is that they were supported by his wife's trust fund. So even though he had a definite disdain for the Americans that he considered entitled and lazy, many probably would consider him to have been, well, I guess I'll just say privileged. So in a letter that Hemingway wrote for the Toronto Star in May 1922, he said, and this is the exact quote, the scum of Greenwich Village, which that's an area of New York. If you're not familiar with it, it's kind of like a bohemian, or it was at least when I was in high school. Now it's just very expensive. But the scum of Greenwich Village, New York, has been skimmed off and deposited on that section of Paris adjacent to the Café Rotunda. They are all nearly loafers, talking about what they're going to do and condemning the work of all artists who have gained any recognition. So I don't know the larger context, but it was just a piece about Americans in Europe. So, I wanted to just read you the summary on the back of the book because I'm curious, what did the publishers say about this? So this is the copy that I have, and on the back of mine, this is the description. The quintessential novel of the lost generation, The Sun Also Rises is one of Ernest Hemingway's masterpieces and a classic example of his spare but powerful writing. A poignant look at the disillusionment and angst of the post-World War I generation, the novel introduces two of Hemingway's most unforgettable characters, Jake Barnes and Lady Brett Ashley. The story follows the flamboyant Brett and the hapless Jake as they journey from the wild nightlife of 1920s Paris to the brutal bullfighting rings of Spain with a motley group of expatriates. It is an age of moral bankruptcy, spiritual dissolution, unrealized love, and vanishing illusions. First published in 1926, The Sun Also Rises helped to establish Hemingway as one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. Interesting. Okay. So moving on, I would say, I guess I agree with that summary, but I would just add to it, and you probably noticed this, that it's not very plot heavy. Not much really seems to happen. It's more about, I guess, the disillusionment felt by the narrator or his interior struggles to come to terms with his disability, to come to terms with his relationship with Brett, or with the fact that there isn't going to be a relationship between the two of them. Let's see. And yeah, so I would just say that, I'll just add that. Now I have a couple of reviews that I'm going to read you, and I picked the ones that I thought were the best, or the most interesting. So this first one was written in 1927 by The Dial. If to report correctly and endlessly the vapid talk and indolent thinking of Montparnasse cafe idlers is to write a novel, Mr. Hemingway has written a novel. His characters are as shallow as the saucers in which they stack their daily emotions, and instead of interpreting his material, he has been content to make a carbon copy of a not significant surface of life in Paris. Time magazine called it a semi-humorous love tragedy, and then they didn't even get between Jake and Brett. They didn't even get the details about Jake or Brett right. I believe they referred to Brett as American and she's British, and they when they were discussing Jake, they got whatever his job in the military was during the war, they listed the wrong job. So their review was very disrespectful in that it got a lot of facts wrong, and then it also calls their love story semi-humorous. Let's see. Burton Rasco says, this is a good one. Every sentence that Hemingway writes is fresh and alive. There is no one writing whose prose has more of the force and vibrancy of good, natural speech. And then in an anonymous review in the New York Times, The Sun Also Rises is a truly gripping story told in a lean, hard, athletic narrative prose that puts literary English to shame. And then in The Atlantic, Hemingway's book deals with people who have no morals. They are wafted about by their passions. They have no religion and no ideals in the accepted sense of the word, but they have courage and friendship and mental honestness. And they are alive, amazingly real and alive. And then a reviewer for the Boston Evening Transcript pointed at Jake's wound as being symbolic. And I just like to make a connection to The Wasteland, which I know we did a while ago. But the Fisher King, who is wounded in the genitals, and the legend is that when he is healed, the land will be healed. So Jake is often referred to as another Fisher King figure, but the reviewer for the Boston Evening Transcript also says that all of the characters are impotent in one way or another, and that this is because of their disgust with the hypocrisy of World War I and their larger sense of spiritual angst. And then Edmund Wilson, he is, gosh, I don't know if he's still alive. That I told you that he worked at Princeton, and when I was in my late 20s, I sent a cover letter, but it was a poem. It wasn't a traditional cover letter. It was a poem, and he actually wrote back to me. I don't think I still have the letter, but anyway, Edmund Wilson was the first American reviewer to really see and argue for a greater depth and message in The Sun Also Rises. Let me just find it. Hang on a second. It's a really long quote, so I didn't write it down. Find it. So he started the commentary, which pointed to something. Oh no! Don't tell me the pages. Something called the Hemingway Code. Shoot. Why did I not pay? Oh, here we go. Okay, hang on a second. 15, 14. Okay, so Edmund Wilson said, the barbarity of the world is also the theme of The Sun Also Rises. The whole interest of The Sun Also Rises lies in the attempts of the hero and the heroine to disengage themselves from this world, or rather to arrive at some method of living in it honorably. The real story there is the story of their attempts to do this, attempts by which, in such a world, they are always bound to lose in everything except honor. So you'll notice that Wilson points out that it is the world around them that is more messed up than they are, and that the best they can kind of do is to try and live in this world in a detached way, honorably. So this started a discussion of what was called the Hemingway Code. So reviewers began to say that that within The Sun Also Rises, there was this code. Here I have a quote for you. There is a definite code by which characters are judged and which they judge each other. Courage, honesty, and skill are all important rules of the code. And then another quote from Edmund Wilson in 1939. He says, the young American who tells this story is the only character who keeps up standards of conduct, and he is prevented by his disability from dominating and directing the woman who otherwise might have loved him. Yet one can catch hold of a code in all the drunkenness and social chaos. Everyone loses in the long run, but in the meantime, we can lose with honor. So my question, or our discussion question for later, is going to be, so part of the reason why Hemingway received such criticism was because, this was published in 1926. In 1929, the stock market crashed, and there was a huge sense and reaction against capitalism, and we kind of saw that in Dos Passos with the 42nd parallel. That's one reason why he writes about socialism so much. This was somewhat of a trend at the time, and so a lot of reviewers and just people in general felt that with so much going on in the world, and especially with the Great Depression, for Hemingway not to have more of a social message, or for him not to say anything against capitalism was, I guess, negligent. So, and literature that did criticize capitalism and discuss other economic systems was considered to be more useful. So Hemingway didn't do any of that. So initially, there were a lot of responses to The Sun Also Rises as being kind of meaningless, with characters that were superficial and vapid, who just drank too much. And then about 10 years later, reviewers started to discuss this thing called the Hemingway Code. So the characters may be in a world that is messed up, and maybe at times they are flawed, but they live by a code, and they have courage, honesty, and skill. Well, they lose in the long run, but they lose with honor. So my question to you is, and the question we're going to discuss on Zoom, is, do you see any such code? Do you see any of the characters anywhere in the first 12 chapters that we read adhering to any sense of courage or honesty or just ethics, period? Do you see honorable conduct? Do you see anyone not doing something or doing something because of a sense of honor or duty of consciousness? So I looked pretty hard. Well, I don't want to tell you my thoughts, but so The Sun Also Rises begins with an introduction to Robert Kahn. I've always found this introduction to be very off-putting, I guess, and I would say that because one of the major characteristics about Kahn that is highlighted is his ethnicity, that he's Jewish. And I always wondered from the very first time I read this, why does Hemingway make such a big deal of that? And I still don't know. I'm not sure if Kahn is said to represent sort of the older system or the older values that are outdated and that don't really hold up in this new post-World War War, and he's supposed to be the eternal outsider. But I don't understand why his ethnicity had to be an issue. But anyway, he's introduced as a Princeton boxing champion who comes from a wealthy family, has an unhappy marriage. His wife, he's going to leave his wife, but she beats him to the punch and leaves him first. And he falls in with a literary crowd and goes to Paris, where he writes a book, takes it back to America, gets it published, and becomes somewhat of a success. So when he comes back to Paris, he's got a much bigger ego. He meets Brett, who the narrator Jake already has a relationship with, and that's kind of how everyone's paths cross, or I guess what holds them together, or at least Kahn and Jake. They both have this interest in Brett. So in chapter 2, Robert Kahn goes to see Jake at the newspaper where he works, and this is on page 18. And I know the first time I read this, I thought, oh, this is where it's really going to start, because Kahn says to Jake, I can't stand it to think my life is going by so fast and I'm not really living it. And Jake says, nobody ever lives their lives all the way up except bullfighters. And then Robert says, don't you ever get the feeling that your life is going by and you're not taking advantage of it? And then he says, I want to go to South America. And Jake tells him kind of that old adage that wherever you go, there you are. In other words, you can't try to escape your problems, because most of the time the problem is you, and you take yourself with you. But Jake just tells Robert, why don't you start living your life here? And so I guess my point is that it seems like this might be where the action is going to kick in, that maybe Robert is going to do something to really start living, but that's not what happens. So if this feels anticlimactic to you, as it did to me, again, this is meant to embody the sense of meaninglessness that followed World War I, the sense that traditional beliefs were no longer reliable, and just that everything was pretty meaningless and empty. So in chapter 3, Jake picks up a prostitute to have dinner with, and this is where we meet Brett. She's introduced on page 30, and at least initially, the emphasis is completely placed on her physical appearance. We're told Brett was damn good looking. She wore a slip-over jersey sweater and a tweed skirt, and her hair was brushed back like a boy's. She started all that. And of course, Kahn immediately falls for her, and this definitely bothers Jake. Jake and Brett are talking, and they're in a club/bar, and he says to her, you made a new one there. I suppose you like to add them up. And she tells him, don't talk like a fool. And he says, you do. She says, oh, well, what if I do? So I don't know how you reacted to Brett. I've never really liked her that much. And that may be, actually, opinions about Brett are pretty interesting in terms of, as far as from reviewers. A lot of them attribute that to Hemingway's own issues with women. So Gershon Legman in 1949, in a continuation of previous scholarship, really scrutinizing Hemingway's treatment of women and his female characters, said, quote, "No modern writer has taken the hatred of women farther than has Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway kills off the women in all his books or reserves for them a fate apparently worse than death, sexual frustration." So, yeah, that's pretty accurate if you look at Brett. So back to the novel and a definite code by which the characters are judged and by which they judge each other. Courage, honesty, and skill are all important rules of the code. Or do you see more? If to report correctly and endlessly the vapid talk and indolent thinking of Montparnasse cafe idlers is to write a novel, Mr. Hemingway has written a novel. So moving along to chapter 4, this is me just combing through the chapters trying to find evidence of a code. Brett and Jake leave the club where everyone is dancing together, and they're in, it's like a carriage, and Jake kisses Brett and she stops him. Now, maybe this is evidence of a code, or is this just Brett being selfish because she knows where this is headed, or maybe where this can't be headed. So on page 34, hold on, I'll read it to you, the exchange between them. So again, is this a code that exists in either of them, both of them, one of them, or are they just being selfish? So let's see. I don't want to go through that. Oh, she says it's about halfway down page 34. "I don't want to go through that hell again. We'd better keep away from each other. But, darling, I have to see you. It isn't all that, you know. No, but it always gets to be. That's my fault. Don't we all pay for the things we do, though?" And then he comments on her eyes. And then Brett says, "When I think of the hell I've put chaps through, I'm paying for it all now." "Don't talk like a fool," I said. "Besides, what happened to me is supposed to be funny. I never think about it." "Oh, no, I'll let you don't." "Well, let's shut up about it. I laughed about it to myself once." She wasn't looking at me. Okay, moving on to page 35. "It's funny," I said. "It's very funny. And it's a lot of fun, too, to be in love." "Do you think so?" Her eyes looked flat again. "I don't mean fun that way. In a way, it's an enjoyable feeling." "No," she said. "I think it's hell on earth." "It's good to see each other." "No, I don't think it is." "Don't you want to?" "I have to." We were sitting now like two strangers. On the right was the Parc Montsouris. The restaurant where they have the pool of live trout and where you can sit and look out over the park was closed and dark. The driver leaned his head around. "Where do you want to go?" I asked. And Brett tells the driver that she wants to go to the Cafe Select. And when they get there, Brett goes out because she wants to continue drinking and I guess partying. And Jake goes up to sleep. He uses the excuse that he has a horrible headache. But then when he's alone in his room, he's definitely, well, he says, "To hell with Brett, to hell with you, Lady Ashley." And he's kind of reflecting on his wound and their relationship when Brett shows up at his room. And he lives in sort of, like, I guess, a rooming house, which is where you rent rooms rather than entire apartments. So she comes up to his room. Meanwhile, there's this Count, I'm going to pronounce his name wrong because I don't have it in front of me. It's like Mippy Populus. Sorry, I'm saying it wrong, but I can't find it. Yeah. So this count is with her, waiting outside in the limousine, and they have alcohol with them, or they go get it. And you get the definite sense that Brett is just very careless with her actions. Jake has feelings for her. He went up to his room to be alone because they just finished having a conversation about why they can't be together, and then she chose to go out to this other bar / club rather than sit and be with him or talk to him. And then she comes back to his room later, drunk, with another guy waiting outside in the car. And she tells Jake that, she says, "Oh, I told him I was in love with you. Don't look like that," as if that's going to make things better. And she of course goes. She doesn't stay. They kiss goodnight. And I'll read this last paragraph of, it's the end of chapter 4. "We kissed again on the stairs, and as I called for the cordon, the concierge muttered something behind her door. I went back upstairs and from the open window watched Brett walking up the street to the big limousine drawn up to the curb under the arc light. She got in and it started off. I turned around. On the table was an empty glass and a glass half full of brandy and soda. I took them both out to the kitchen and poured the half full glass down the sink. I turned off the gas in the dining room, kicked off my slippers sitting on the bed, and got into bed. This was Brett that I had felt like crying about. Then I thought of her walking up the street and stepping into the car as I had last seen her, and of course, in a little while, I felt like hell again. It is awfully easy to be hard-boiled about anything in the daytime, but at night it is another thing." Okay, I love that sentence, by the way. It is awfully easy to be hard-boiled about anything in the daytime, but at night it is another thing. I love that sentence. I mean, that's such a great sentence. It's Count Mippy Populus. Yeah, I was right. So I have more examples of scenes where I don't think anyone shows any consideration for other people. I don't know if, let's see, if you want to hear more. I'll just give you one more. It's in chapter 6 on page 49. This is where Jake and Robert run into Harvey Stone. Harvey Stone is a fellow expatriate. He is sitting alone outside of a bar, and we're told that he has a pile of saucers in front of him, and he needed a shave. And so Jake and Robert sit down with Harvey, and they just have some small talk. And Harvey tells them, "I haven't had anything to eat for 5 days." And then they ask, "Well, why? What's wrong?" And he says, "No money. Money hasn't come." But you definitely get the sense that he has been drinking. So one more scene. One more. This is my last try. Count Mippy Populus comes up to Jake's room with Brett, and the three of them are drinking together. And the Count tells them, he says, "You see," he's talking to Jake now, because presumably he's already had this conversation with Brett. He says on page 67, "You see, Mr. Barnes, it is because I have lived very much that now I can enjoy everything so well. Don't you find it like that?" "Yes, absolutely. I know," said the Count. "That is the secret. You must get to know the values." And then Brett says, "Doesn't anything ever happen to your values?" And the Count says, "No, not anymore." And she asks him, "Never fall in love?" "Always," said the Count. "I am always in love." And then Brett says to him, "You haven't any values. You're dead, that's all." And he says, "No, my dear, you're not right. I'm not dead at all." So to me, the Count seems like the one figure who kind of has some life in him, who tries to have some type of code or system of ethics. And Brett shoots him down very quickly. but maybe you have a different view on this than I do. So, so again, the question is, do you see in this novel a definite code by which the characters are judged and by which they judge each other? Courage, honesty, and skill are all important rules of the code. Or you could say, yet one can catch hold of a code in all the drunkenness and social chaos. Everyone loses in the long run, but in the meantime, we can lose with honor. Or would you say that you see this more as, if to report correctly and endlessly on the vapid talk and indolent thinking of Montparnasse cafe idlers is to write a novel, Mr. Hemingway has written a novel. So how do you see it? Code or empty, vapid, indolent thinking and talk? So I'll see you soon.